We would like to send out a special thanks to Storyworth for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Storyworth is a meaningful gift you and your family can treasure forever, and you can get started right away. Go to storyworth.com/cold to get $10 off your first purchase. We would also like to thank the podcast Toxic, the Britney Spears story, for sponsoring our podcast. Listen and follow along to Toxic, the Britney Spears story on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you, and enjoy the show. May 14th, 1991. Vidor, Texas. 34-year-old Kathy Page is found dead inside her car after an apparent crash into a drainage ditch. While the scene resembles an accident, the evidence shows that Kathy was strangled to death and the crash was staged. Since Kathy's marriage to her estranged husband Steve Page was falling apart, and there were a number of suspicious actions on his part, Kathy's family believed that Steve was responsible for murdering her, but the authorities do not believe there is enough evidence to file charges, and the case remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and after a one-week hiatus, I have now returned in order to cover a very controversial and highly requested case, the 1991 murder of Kathy Page. This story has been featured on such true crime shows as Unsolved Mysteries and Cold Justice, but it has garnered some additional notoriety over the past few years because it was the apparent inspiration for the critically acclaimed film 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Released in 2017, 3 Billboards stars Frances McDormand as a woman from a small fictional town whose teenage daughter is raped and murdered, and since the local police are unable to make any progress in the investigation, McDormand's character expresses her frustration by renting a trio of roadside billboards which contain the messages, quote, "Raped while dying, how come Chief Willoughby, still no arrests," end quote. The film was written and directed by Martin McDonough, who claimed he got the idea for this story during a bus trip to the United States during the 1990s, as he passed by a series of billboards in which a murder victim's family expressed their dissatisfaction with the investigation. While McDonough was unable to recall the exact case mentioned on these billboards, it seems very likely that they were in reference to the murder of a wife and mother named Kathy Page, who was killed in the small town of Vidor, Texas, during a failed attempt to stage her death to look like a car accident. Now, aside from the basic premise about the billboards, the plot and characters in 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri are completely fictitious and have nothing to do with this case. In the film, no one seems to have any real idea who committed the murder, but the biggest source of frustration for the family of Kathy Page is that they are confident that the perpetrator was her estranged husband, Steve Page, and believe that he was never charged with the crime because the local authorities botched the investigation and may have even been protecting him. Earlier this year, we passed the 30th anniversary of Kathy's murder, and many people think this case should have been solved a long time ago. Regardless of whether Steve Page is guilty or innocent of this crime, this is a very tragic story which has caused a lot of hurt and dissension between 2 families, and it's still up in the air whether there will ever be a conclusive resolution. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Kathy Page. Our story begins in 1991 in Vidor, Texas, a small town of around 11,000 people located in Orange County, and our central figure is 34-year-old Lucille Catherine Page, who goes by the name Kathy. Originally born in Hollandale, Mississippi to James and Dorothy Fulton, Kathy had a total of 2 brothers and 3 sisters, and she eventually relocated to Texas. At this point, she is currently living in Vidor with her 2 daughters, 12-year-old Erin and 7-year-old Monica. Their house is located on a dead-end street next to Interstate 10, and Kathy works as a waitress at the Hofbrau restaurant in the nearby city of Beaumont. She originally married her husband Steve Page in 1978 while she was pregnant with Erin, but their relationship has not been in a good place in a long time. After they got into a heated argument, Kathy asked Steve for a separation, and he agreed to move out of their house into an apartment. In spite of this, Steve maintained that they continued to remain cordial and friendly with each other, as he believed that Kathy was simply going through a phase in which she needed to find herself, but was willing to work things out with him. However, Kathy's family believed that the marriage had no chance of being saved, and that Kathy was planning to divorce Steve sometime in the near future. On the evening of May the 13th, only one day after Steve spent his first night at his new apartment, he was contacted by Kathy, who asked if he would babysit their 2 daughters. Kathy told Steve that she wanted to go out to a bar in Beaumont with a friend of hers named Charlotte Swearingen Morgan, so Steve agreed to return to the house to watch over the kids. Steve claimed that he last saw Kathy leave between 11:15 and 11:30 p.m. before he went to sleep a short time later, but sometime over the next 5 hours, Kathy would wind up dead under very strange circumstances. At around 4:20 a.m. on the morning of May the 14th, a newspaper carrier would discover Kathy's black Mercury tracer in a drainage ditch alongside Interstate 10. The location was only 114 yards away from Kathy's residence, though the vehicle appeared to be pointing in the opposite direction. Kathy was lying dead in the driver's seat, so the Vidor Police Department were summoned to the scene, and at first glance, it appeared that she had been killed in a tragic accident. When Detective Sergeant Ray Mosley and another investigator went to the Page residence, Steve answered the door wearing nothing but a pair of boxer shorts. Mosley asked Steve if he was the husband of Kathy Page and whether he knew his wife's whereabouts, but Steve replied she was not home. Before Mosley could inform him about what happened, he noticed that Steve appeared to look down the street in the direction where Kathy's car had been found. After the investigators were invited into the house, Steve was finally notified that his wife had been killed, and Mosley noticed Steve go through some radical changes of behavior, as he appeared to start crying and hysterically throwing himself on the couch, before his emotions would quickly dissipate and he would go back to carry on conversations with no sign of tears in his eyes. The living room lights were left off the entire time the police were inside the house, and even when they asked Steve to turn them on, he never did, though Mosley did notice a small pile of clothes on the floor. Steve also never asked to see Kathy or made any attempt to visit the accident scene. It did not take long for investigators to reach the conclusion that Kathy did not actually die in a car crash and that her so-called accident had been staged. Even though the drainage ditch was fairly deep, there was very little damage to the interior or exterior of the Mercury tracer and no sign of skid marks anywhere. Kathy's feet were pushed back against the seat rather than stretched towards the pedals, and even though she was not wearing her seatbelt, she remained in a reclined position in the driver's seat and had not been thrown forward. Kathy also did not appear to have any wounds or injuries on her body, though she did have a laceration on the back of her head, as well as a broken nose and a black eye that did not appear to be caused by a crash. Even though soft drinks from a fast food restaurant were on the floorboard, the impact of the crash had not caused them to spill or tip over, and Kathy's purse was sitting upright in the passenger seat. The rearview mirror had also been turned sideways and was facing the driver's seat and touching the windshield. It would be theorized that someone had accidentally adjusted the mirror while loading Kathy's body into the car. When an autopsy was performed later that day, it would reveal that Kathy had significant injuries to her neck, and her exact cause of death was manual strangulation. Oddly, while there were traces of bloodstains on Kathy's skin, undergarments, and the inside of her clothing, there was no blood on her outer clothing, though the presence of a blade of grass on the bottom of her jeans seemed to suggest that her body had been dragged at some point. It seemed likely that Kathy had been murdered at another location before the perpetrator cleaned and dressed her dead body. They then placed Kathy inside her car and ran it off the road into the ditch to give off the false impression of a fatal accident. The autopsy also revealed the presence of semen in Kathy's vagina to indicate that she had sexual intercourse a short time before her death. Investigators soon learned that Kathy's story about going out for the night with her friend Charlotte was completely false, and that she was actually meeting up with a secret boyfriend at a Best Western hotel in Beaumont. This man did not live in the area, and had originally met Kathy a few months earlier when he stopped at the Hofbrau restaurant while she was working there, and they developed an instant connection. Since he usually stayed at the Best Western whenever he passed through Beaumont, he made arrangements with Kathy to secretly meet up there. When the boyfriend was questioned by police, he admitted that he and Kathy had sex together at the hotel on the night of her death, before she left at around 2:30 a.m. By all accounts, this man was very cooperative with the investigation and passed a polygraph, so he was cleared as a suspect. One of the oddest details of Kathy's death is that when she was found inside her car, she was not wearing makeup, socks, or any of her jewelry, including her watch, earrings, and wedding ring. The boyfriend confirmed that when he last saw Kathy at the hotel, she was dressed in the same clothes she was wearing at the time of her death, but he was also certain that she was still wearing her makeup and jewelry. According to those who knew her, Kathy usually only took off her jewelry when she got ready for bed, leading to speculation that she made it home at some point before she was killed. Another surprising revelation from Kathy's autopsy is that some of the semen found in her vagina did not have any sperm, which indicated that she had intercourse with someone who had undergone a vasectomy. While Kathy's boyfriend never had a vasectomy, but Steve Page had received one months earlier. When confronted about this, Steve claimed that when he first arrived at the house that night, Kathy stepped out of the shower while wearing a towel, and they decided to have sex on the carpet in the living room before she left. However, Kathy's family had a hard time believing this story, as prior to moving out, Steve had been sleeping on the couch, and there did not appear to be any intimacy left in the relationship. It seemed unlikely that Kathy would agree to have sex with Steve right before going out to meet up with another man. The Fulton family would notice a number of suspicious actions on Steve's part following Kathy's death, though Steve and his own family would later dispute that a lot of these events even took place. According to Kathy's parents, James and Dorothy Fulton, Steve phoned their residence that morning to inform them about what happened. The Fultons said they immediately went over to the Page residence, and when they arrived, they saw Steve walking around the living room, wiping his hands with a bath cloth, while dressed in red shorts and a white t-shirt, and he appeared to have a scratch on his nose. Shortly thereafter, Dorothy said she noticed Steve doing laundry and washing clothes. There have been disputing accounts from different witnesses who were at the residence that morning, who have both confirmed and denied that they heard the washing machine running, though most of the people who denied it were members of Steve's family. According to Kathy's sister, Jan Kelly, when she visited the residence, Steve made a comment that Kathy had gone out drinking and was probably drunk or taking Valium when she crashed her car into the ditch, even though the toxicology report would show no traces of any alcohol in her system. Kathy did have a legal prescription to use Valium, but Steve alleged on a few occasions that Kathy was also using cocaine, though he later said these allegations were untrue, and he had made the mistake of repeating rumors he heard about Kathy's drug use. The day after Kathy's death, one of her other sisters, Sherry Valentine, visited the Page residence and said she noticed a very strong smell and saw oscillating fans being used to dry out the carpet. Steve claimed he was cleaning the carpet after spilling some fish grease on it, and said the spill occurred on the very same spot where he and Kathy had sex on the evening of May the 13th. There has been a lot of dispute from different witnesses about the details of how and when Steve supposedly cleaned the carpet, as his daughter Erin and one of his own sisters have always claimed they personally witnessed Steve spill the grease, but this incident did not occur until after Kathy's funeral. Oddly, Steve told multiple members of the Fulton family that he did not want the police coming over to his house because they might find blood on the carpet at a spot where Kathy had previously shaved her legs, and he did not trust the police, believing they had planted evidence on his friends before. When Steve was interviewed by Detective Mosley at the police station, he even repeated the same statement about not wanting the police at his house because he feared they might find something to incriminate him. When police told Steve they wanted to perform an autopsy on Kathy, he told them that he didn't want anyone cutting into her, so James Fulton had to be the one to authorize it. The autopsy also seemed to indicate that Kathy was manually strangled by a left-handed person, and there would be contradictory accounts about whether Steve was left-handed. Steve and his family maintained that he was right-handed, even though members of the Fulton family and other witnesses claimed they had seen him perform tasks with his left hand. The Fultons also noticed some suspicious behavior from one of Steve's best friends, a private investigator named Roger Howell. Roger told the family that he needed to take photographs of Kathy's body in order to help Steve, and he asked to view the body at the funeral, though they could not understand why. During a visit to the Page home, Sherry claimed that she saw Roger enter the bathroom with Steve while carrying a manila envelope. When they walked out, Sherry noticed that the envelope was bulky and made a metallic sound when it moved. While Steve and Roger later claimed that the envelope was actually a bag of candy, the Fultons have always suspected that it contained Kathy's watch, as Steve needed to get rid of it, since it would have proved she arrived home and took it off before she was killed. One of Kathy's co-workers at the Hofbrau restaurant also claimed that Roger phoned her on the morning of May the 14th to inform her about what happened to Kathy, but he specifically stated that she had been strangled to death, even though the autopsy to determine the exact cause of death would not be performed until hours later. Kathy's friend Charlotte would confirm that on the night of her death, Kathy had phoned her to let her know that she was planning to secretly meet up with her boyfriend at a hotel. Kathy told Charlotte that Steve might attempt to check up on her, so he asked Charlotte to cover for her by not answering the phone in case Steve called. Well, Charlotte told police that she received a call at 2:30 a.m. that morning, and she impulsively answered it, but the caller immediately hung up, leading her to suspect it was Steve. Charlotte did receive a call from Steve sometime between 5:30 and 6 a.m., where he informed her that Kathy had not yet come home, so Charlotte told him they had been out together before they parted ways hours earlier. There has been some dispute about when the second phone call actually took place, as Steve would keep changing his story about what time he made the call, providing such times as 2:30, 3:30, and 4:30. While this has never been corroborated, Sherry Valentine claimed that she heard from Steve's sister-in-law that after Kathy left for the night, Steve found a pair of phone numbers Kathy had scrawled down in a notebook next to the phone. The first number was Charlotte's phone number, and the second was for the Best Western Hotel in Beaumont. Kathy's family theorized that after Steve called Charlotte's number and discovered she was at home, he decided to call the second number, and after learning it was for a hotel, he became convinced that Kathy was with another man. When Kathy arrived home later that morning, Steve may have confronted her about this, and things escalated to the point where he raped Kathy and strangled her to death before staging the accident scene. Of course, Steve denied any involvement in Kathy's death, and when he was interviewed on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in April of 1998, he offered his own theory about whom he believed killed her. Steve claimed that he had received a number of phone threats in which he was warned that the same thing which happened to Kathy could also happen to him. He said that a member of a prominent Italian family who were involved in the Beaumont Mafia was responsible for Kathy's death, and the Vidor Police Department were attempting to frame him for the crime and refusing to investigate other leads. For their part, the Fulton family believed that the Vidor PD and the Orange County District Attorney's Office were covering for Steve and did not want to arrest him, as a number of the investigating officers, including Detective Sergeant Ray Mosley, knew him personally, and Steve's parents were reportedly friends with the chief of police. The Vidor PD did make a number of mistakes in the investigation, as they took pictures of Kathy's death scene with no film inside the camera, so there were no actual photos of the crime scene to be entered into evidence. For unknown reasons, the district attorney's office refused to grant the police a warrant to search the Page residence until years after Kathy's death took place, and the search failed to uncover any evidence. During this time period, the Fultons noticed that whenever they placed flowers on Kathy's grave, they would always return to find them vandalized or thrown away, so they became convinced that Steve was responsible. When the Fultons hired a private investigator to follow Steve around, he managed to videotape him in the act of kicking a set of flowers off Kathy's gravesite, so Steve was subsequently indicted on the charge of desecrating a grave and received a sentence of probation. Steve eventually moved out of state and took his two daughters, Erin and Monica, to Tennessee to live with his sister. Since a grand jury declined to indict Steve with Kathy's murder, James Fulton became very frustrated with the lack of progress in the investigation, so he responded by placing hand-painted signs alongside Interstate 10, sharing such messages as, quote, "Vidor police botched up the case, waiting for a confession, this could happen to you," end quote. As the years went on, James decided to publicly express his frustration by renting a series of billboards along the interstate containing statements like, quote, "This is Orange County, City of Vidor. Here you can get by with brutally murdering a woman." End quote. A wrongful death lawsuit would be filed against Steve on behalf of James and Dorothy Fulton and one of Kathy's sisters, Diane Daigle, who was acting as next friend for Kathy's daughter Monica since she was still a minor at that time. The Fultons sought to prevent Steve from collecting on Kathy's life insurance, and the case would go through a pair of mistrials in civil court, which featured conflicting testimony from the Fulton and Page families. While Kathy's sister Sherry testified that Steve was controlling, jealous, and abusive, and would often grab or push Kathy during arguments, Steve and his family denied this, and their daughter Erin testified that she never personally witnessed anything like this. However, during the third trial in October of 1999, the Fultons finally won a civil judgment against Steve, as the jury awarded them a total of $200,000 in damages and life insurance, with $150,000 going to the Fultons and the other $50,000 going to Monica. Now that Steve had lost a wrongful death lawsuit and his attempts to appeal the verdict were unsuccessful, James Fulton felt more confident about publicly accusing him of his daughter's murder on his billboards. He soon erected a new one which featured a photo of Steve's face and read, quote, "In Vidor, he got by with murder, found responsible for wife's death in civil court. Appeals court upheld conviction, pleaded guilty of desecrating her grave. Criminal case, no arrests." End quote. In 2012, James posted a new billboard featuring both Steve and Kathy's photos, and it read, quote, "Steve Page brutally murdered his wife in 1991. Vidor PD does not want to solve this case. I believe they took a bribe. The Attorney General should investigate. James Fulton, her father." End quote. A billboard has also been put up in a park in Vidor with this message, quote, "Vidor's garbage dump park. Security provided by the local police department. I believe my daughter was being raped while she was strangled to death in 1991. The Vidor Police Department would not accept outside help, and the case has never been solved. I believe the police department did not want to solve this case. Will you be the next unsolved murder? Predators love parks. The Vidor Police Department that did not solve my daughter's murder will be assisting you with any complaints or problems of this so-called park. James Fulton." End quote. Sadly, Dorothy Fulton died in October of 2007 at the age of 73, and another terrible tragedy would take place just over 3 years later when Steve and Kathy's youngest daughter, Monica Page, passed away at the age of 27 in March of 2011. Monica reportedly lived a very troubled life following her mother's death and succumbed to a drug overdose, which some people have suspected was a suicide. The investigation remained quiet for several years until the highly acclaimed movie 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri received a wide theatrical release in November of 2017. Once media outlets started picking up on the fact that the movie's premise appeared to be inspired by Kathy Page's murder, interest in the case was rejuvenated. Vidor Police Chief Rod Carroll, who had only been in office for less than a year at this point, agreed to reopen the investigation, and the Texas Department of Public Safety offered a $6,000 reward for new information. In October of 2018, the case would be featured on an episode of the Oxygen True Crime series Cold Justice, hosted by former Harris County prosecutor Kelly Siegler. The episode was titled "The Case Behind the Billboards" and featured Siegler and her team of investigators taking a fresh look at the case alongside local law enforcement. The biggest new development was when they spoke to an eyewitness who told them that during the early morning hours of May the 14th, 1991, he had been driving down Interstate 10 and saw Steve Page, whom he knew personally, walking away from the spot where Kathy's car had crashed. However, the witness elected not to come forward at that time because he was a married man who had been with his mistress that night, and he did not want his family finding out about the affair. At the end of the Cold Justice episode, the team would submit all the evidence they uncovered, including this new eyewitness statement, to the Orange County District Attorney's Office, but they did not believe the evidence was sufficient enough to file charges against anyone for Kathy's murder. In June of 2021, Crime Stoppers of Southeast Texas raised the reward for information to $50,000, which is the largest reward they've ever offered in an unsolved cold case. At the time of this recording, James Fulton is nearly 90 years old and claims that the billboards he has put up accusing Steve Page of his daughter's murder will remain there until he dies or there's a conviction. Steve is currently living in the Houston area, but after 30 years, the murder of Kathy Page continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to send out a special thanks to our sponsor, Storyworth. This holiday season, I want to give a gift to my loved ones that makes them feel special and unique, just like the relationship we share. That's why I'm giving Storyworth to everyone I care about. Storyworth is offering $10 off your first purchase at storyworth.com/cold. Storyworth is an online service that helps a loved one share stories through thought-provoking questions about their memories and personal thoughts. Every week, Storyworth emails a different story prompt, questions you never thought to ask, such as, what is one of the strangest things that has ever happened to you, and what's a small decision you made that ended up having a big impact on your life? Reading the weekly stories helps connect you with loved ones no matter how near or far you are. Storyworth is a great way to stay in touch with family and helps bridge geographic distance by providing lively discussion topics. This is very essential for someone like myself who currently lives several hours away from my nearest family members, as Storyworth has allowed me to continue to bond with them. It's also quite essential for helping you preserve memories because you can pass on stories and life lessons to your children and their future families. You can also invite family and friends to receive your loved one's stories. My mother has always been an avid scrapbooker her entire life, which is why she has found Storyworth to be so useful and appealing. It makes it so easy and fun for her to share her stories with weekly emailed story prompts, and at the end of the year, she can get her stories bound in a beautiful hardcover book. That's right, after 1 year, Storyworth will compile every story, including your photos, into a beautiful keepsake book that's shipped for free. You can order multiple copies for your siblings, children, or other relatives. My mother and I will definitely cherish our Storyworth books when they're completed, and share it with whoever we can. With Storyworth, I'm giving those I love most a thoughtful, personal gift from the heart and preserving their memories and stories for years to come. Go to storyworth.com/cold and save $10 on your first purchase. That's storyworth.com/cold to save $10 on your first purchase. Also, we would like to take another moment to thank the podcast Toxic, the Britney Spears story. Have you folks been following the Britney Spears saga? If you have, you'll know that Britney has provided the soundtrack for so many people's lives, even though she had no control over her own life. Well, comedians Tess Barker and Babs Gray have released a new investigative podcast that dives deeper into Britney's mysterious situation than anyone else ever has. You might know Tess and Babs from Lady to Lady, or the now legendary Britney's Gram podcast, and years ago, they both launched the hashtag Free Britney movement. They started digging more into Britney's conservatorship and the court system that has allowed it to continue, and you don't want to miss hearing what they found out. On this podcast, you'll be able to join Tess and Babs as they talk to exclusive sources, examine new sides of the story, and uncover disturbing truths about her legal system that go way beyond Britney. In a neat coincidence, just days after we ran our last ad for Toxic on this podcast, the news hit that Britney's conservatorship was finally terminated. But as someone who had never really followed this story much before, I really wanted to learn the full details, and Toxic does an excellent job at presenting them for both Britney fans and casual listeners. So listen and follow along to Toxic, the Britney Spears story on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So it's probably a sign that you're a big Unsolved Mysteries geek when you go to see 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri in a theater and start thinking to yourself, this plot kind of reminds me of the Kathy Page case. And then sure enough, months after the film's release, you learn that the whole storyline involving the Billboards was likely inspired by that case, and it actually wound up getting Kathy's murder more publicity than it had received in years. Like I mentioned in the intro, writer-director Martin McDonagh has never been able to confirm with 100% certainty that the billboards he saw during his bus trip through the United States were for the Kathy Page case, since this occurred many years before the movie was made. But McDonagh did state that he saw the billboards in Texas, and as far as anyone can tell, there are no other documented cases in which a murder victim's family have put up billboards like that. Now, I see dozens of new movies every year, and I picked 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri to be my absolute favorite film of 2017, which deserved all the critical acclaim it received. It earned a total of 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture, with Frances McDormand and Sam Rockwell taking home the Oscars for Best Actress and Best Supporting Actor, respectively. One thing I particularly loved about the film is that it often completely defied the audience's expectations. On the basis of the original trailer, I assumed this was going to be the story of a heroic, inspirational mother seeking justice for her daughter's murder and battling a corrupt, incompetent small-town police department, but it's a lot more complex than that, and the film is populated by three-dimensional characters, none of whom are completely good or completely bad. While you can certainly identify with Frances McDormand's crusade to find her daughter's killer, her character is hardly a saint, as she is portrayed as a very flawed individual whose personal life was already in a bit of a shambles before she even lost her daughter. And it's also possible that Kathy Page's murder is a lot more complex than it appears on the surface. On the basis of how this story had been portrayed on Unsolved Mysteries and Cold Justice, it's easy to assume this is a pretty cut-and-dried, straightforward case of a woman being murdered by her estranged husband while her family fights for justice and becomes incredibly frustrated that no arrest has been made. And that very well may be true, but what makes me look at this case in a slightly different light is a blog which has been published by Kathy and Steve Page's oldest daughter, Erin. The blog is titled A Billboard in Texas and was originally started in January of 2012, and over the years, Erin has made a number of posts in which she has alleged that the Fultons are not the close, tight-knit family unit they have portrayed themselves to be. Erin claims that she and her sister became completely estranged from the Fulton family and is particularly resentful against their patriarch, James Fulton, whom she says she will always refer to as Mr. Fulton rather than her grandfather. In fact, she has accused James and other members of the family of some pretty terrible things, alleging that James sexually abused Kathy, prompting her to run away from home when she was a teenager, and she said that Kathy was completely estranged from her family until a few years before her death. Erin also claimed that Kathy's sister Sherry once left a fake anonymous bomb threat note on her school bus, and even testified about this at the civil trials. Now, I'll just state up front that I have never seen any other corroborating sources to back Erin's allegations about James Fulton, but I will mention that about 10 years ago, I visited the Unsolved Mysteries Wikia page for this case and discovered that someone had vandalized it, accusing James of sexually abusing and possibly even killing his own daughter, and stating that James paid Unsolved Mysteries to feature Kathy's case and presented in a slanted light to point the finger at Steve Page. While I certainly won't deny that Unsolved Mysteries sometimes presented their segments in a very slanted fashion, I never heard of any documented examples where someone associated with one of the cases paid the show to do this. Again, I have no idea if there is any truth to these horrible allegations about James Fulton, and I've never seen them mentioned anywhere outside of Erin's blog, but it just goes to show that Kathy's death has caused a lot of hurt and resentment among the Page and Fulton families. Erin says that the Fultons were so focused on getting revenge on Steve and pushing their own agenda that they never considered how much pain they might cause her and Monica by posting billboards accusing their father of murdering their mother. This is probably just a coincidence, but a similar type of thing actually happens in 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, where Frances McDormand's surviving teenage son becomes angry at his mother's decision to put up the billboards without giving much consideration to how the drama surrounding the ordeal might affect him. Erin has accused the Fultons of spreading misinformation about the case in order to implicate Steve, and she would even go so far as to testify about this at the civil trials. For instance, Erin claims that the Fultons have greatly exaggerated a number of their claims about such things as Steve renting out a carpet cleaner after Kathy's death, as he believed her family already owned this carpet cleaner beforehand. In spite of their allegations about Steve being physically and verbally abusive towards Kathy, Erin testified that she never personally witnessed this. I know you're probably thinking that Steve's story about Kathy getting blood on the living room carpet while shaving her legs sounds pretty ridiculous, but Erin did confirm that she had seen her mother shaving her legs in the living room in the past. In case you're wondering, Erin and Monica always maintained that they went to sleep on the night Kathy died and woke up at 8 a.m. the following morning, without hearing or seeing anything unusual, even though it's been alleged that Kathy's murder took place inside the house while they were there. Now, because Erin was only 12 years old when these events took place, you could easily assume that her father fed her a lot of lies as she was growing up, and brainwashed her into believing that the Fultons were bad people, but Erin openly denies this in one of her blog posts, and she does not defend or speak highly of Steve either. Here's an interesting quote from this post. Quote, "I believe James Fulton and Steve Page have more in common than they would both care to admit. They both mistreated their children, and they both lost a daughter. To me, this billboard is not about my mother. It is about two stubborn, selfish men with too much guilt to carry. James Fulton gets to pretend he is avenging his daughter's death, and Steve Page gets to pretend he is some sort of victim. The billboard is a crutch for them both." End quote. It seems like after moving her and Monica to Tennessee to live with Steve's sister, Steve lost all interest in raising his children, and Erin says they are now completely estranged and no longer have a relationship. She has never flat out said that she believes Steve is guilty of murder, but once stated during a December 2018 article in the Houston Chronicle, quote, "I don't want it to be my dad. I don't want my dad to have killed my mom. What I want is the truth." End quote. During that same article, Erin also made a cryptic statement that when Monica passed away, she began to see her father for who he really was at her memorial service. I'm certainly not going to accuse Erin of posting any lies or false information on her blog, because I'm sure she sincerely believes a lot of the stuff she has shared, regardless of whether or not it's true. Erin has experienced way too much trauma for one person to handle in their lifetime, as not only she lost her mother and seen her father get accused of killing her, but she has also lost her only sister at the young age of 27. In the Cold Justice episode, there's a scene where Kelly Siegler gathers the entire Fulton family together for a meeting to discuss the case, and when they mention Monica's death, James becomes so emotional that he can no longer speak and asks to leave the room. Well, the way Erin tells it, neither James nor anyone else from that family seemed to care much about her or Monica following Kathy's death, so she believed her grandfather's emotional breakdown on camera was all for show. Regardless of whether or not that's true, Erin did not make an appearance at all on the Cold Justice episode, but her blog provides a sharp contrast to how the Fulton family have been portrayed in the media and on true crime shows about this case. However, even if Erin's allegations about the Fultons spreading lies and misinformation to implicate her father are correct, that doesn't change the fact that there is still plenty of evidence out there which looks pretty damning for Steve Page, and it's really hard to come up with an alternate scenario that doesn't involve him being complicit in Kathy's death. While Steve has never been charged with Kathy's murder, the Fultons did manage to win a wrongful death lawsuit against him, though the burden of proof for a jury in a civil trial is much lower than a criminal trial. Steve was also charged and convicted of desecrating Kathy's grave, which was backed up by videotape evidence, and while Steve said he did this out of the frustration and anger of being falsely accused by the Fultons, it still doesn't look good for him. It's interesting how in all the older photographs of Steve from when he was married to Kathy, he is clean-shaven, but when he was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries and Cold Justice, he had a beard. Erin's blog hints that this may have been intentional, as Steve decided to grow the beard to disguise himself as a response to having his photo plastered all over the billboards accusing him of murder. Steve is interviewed at his home by a pair of investigators on the Cold Justice episode, but the whole scene is very bizarre because Steve comes out to speak with them inside their car while he's shirtless and barefoot and dressed in nothing more than a pair of shorts. It's an amusing parallel to when the Vidor Police Department first showed up at the Page residence to inform Steve about Kathy's death, where he answered the door wearing nothing but a pair of boxer shorts and did not bother putting any other clothing on while the police were there. It's an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of things, but apparently, Steve feels most comfortable being questioned by the police while he's shirtless. So before we talk more about the case against Steve, we do have to explore other scenarios which involve Kathy being killed by another individual, and the only one which would seem to make sense would be her falling victim to the secret boyfriend she was having an affair with. Now, this boyfriend's name has never been released publicly, and for many years, there was virtually no information out there about him at all, other than that he was very cooperative with investigators, passed a polygraph, and was not considered to be a suspect. However, the boyfriend did agree to be interviewed on camera during the Cold Justice episode, though his face was blurred out to conceal his identity. Before I watched this, I didn't know any details about the nature of his relationship with Kathy, but it sounds like he was not from the area and was just passing through Beaumont when he met Kathy while eating at the restaurant where she worked. When he returned to Beaumont on the evening of May the 13th, 1991, he was staying at the Best Western Hotel and wanted Kathy to meet him there, which is why she arranged for Steve to babysit their kids. Now, given that she had asked Steve for a separation and he had just moved out of the house into a new apartment, it obviously wasn't ideal for Kathy to ask Steve to come back there, but it sounds like her decision to meet up with her boyfriend was a last-minute thing, and she just could not find anyone else who could babysit for her. Well, I never thought the boyfriend was a viable suspect to begin with, but finding out that he didn't even live in the area makes it less likely that he could have killed Kathy. Why would he go to the trouble of driving over 10 miles from Beaumont to Vidor to stage a fake car accident just over 100 yards from Kathy's residence? Since he obviously would have had to use Kathy's vehicle to get there, what would he have used as transportation back to Beaumont? In fact, given his unfamiliarity with the area, would the boyfriend have even known where Kathy's house was to begin with? This guy was already cleared by investigators, so I think we can safely say that he had no involvement in Kathy's death. But if Steve found out about their secret rendezvous at the hotel that night, then you can understand why things might have escalated into murder after she returned home. As far as other alternate suspects, well, I know that during his Unsolved Mysteries interview, Steve implied that Kathy was killed by someone affiliated with the so-called Beaumont Mafia, and I can safely say that's one of the most laughable statements in the history of the show. In fact, if you do a Google search on the phrase Beaumont Mafia, most of the matches you're going to find are sources about this case which mention Steve's statement, so this leads me to suspect that no such thing exists, as Beaumont, Texas does not exactly strike me as a place that would be a hotbed for mob activity. I know Steve claimed that he received a bunch of threatening phone calls from people who were supposedly involved in Kathy's death, but Erin actually brought up a solid point to counter this in her blog. As far as Erin recalls, during the entire time she lived in her family's house in Vidor, the doors were never locked. If her father was really receiving threatening phone calls and thought the mafia was after him, why wouldn't he have taken steps to ensure the house was always locked or added extra security measures to protect himself and his family? And really, if the mafia really wanted to kill someone in order to send a message, I don't believe they would do so by attempting to stage a fake car accident. If the mafia did want to stage an accident, they probably would have done a far less sloppy job. That's the thing with Kathy's death scene. It was just so poorly staged that it didn't fool the police for a second, and you get the impression that it was done by someone who panicked and didn't have much idea what they were doing. Kathy's boyfriend confirmed that she left the hotel in Beaumont at 2:30 a.m., and it takes between 10 to 15 minutes to drive to Vidor. Since the car was discovered at 4:20 a.m., there obviously wasn't a great deal of time for someone to kill Kathy and stage the crime without thinking everything through. And really, since the car was found only 114 yards from the Page residence, it would have been easy for Steve to drive the car to that spot with Kathy's body inside and run it into the drainage ditch before walking back home. For years, it was assumed that no eyewitnesses saw Steve do this, but the big piece of new evidence that emerged during the filming of the Cold Justice episode was the man who came forward and claimed that he passed the car in the ditch that morning and saw Steve leaving the scene. This guy claimed he knew Steve personally and recognized him, but because he was with his mistress at the time, he did not want to tell the authorities about what he saw, for fear that his wife would find out he was cheating on her. Now obviously, given that this guy waited over 2 decades to share this information, you can understand the credibility issues here. The Cold Justice investigators did manage to track down this man's mistress, and while she confirmed being with him that night, she was apparently asleep inside his car when he drove past the crime scene, so she had no memory of seeing anything. But the investigators also spoke to the witness's brother, who confirmed that he had heard him share the story about witnessing Steve walk away from the drainage ditch years beforehand. So at the very least, it does not sound like this witness just decided to come forward because of all the newfound attention surrounding the case from the whole 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri comparison. But it also sounds like his statement was not the one piece of evidence required to finally convince the district attorney to file murder charges against Steve. Another unique character in this whole saga is Steve's close friend Roger Howell, who seemed to keep inserting himself into the investigation in the days following Kathy's death, and was not exactly cooperative when investigators attempted to interview him on the Cold Justice episode. It's been alleged that Roger helped Steve cover up the crime, as we have the story from Sherry Valentine that she saw Roger exiting the bathroom at the Page residence carrying a manila envelope which might have contained Kathy's missing wristwatch. And we also have the claim for one of Kathy's co-workers that Roger told her that Kathy had been strangled to death before her autopsy was even performed. Since Roger should not have known this information at the time, this seems to imply that Steve could have told Roger about what he did. The missing wristwatch has always been the subject of a lot of debate, because when he was initially questioned by police, Steve told him that he had been looking in the jewelry box and noticed that Kathy's watch was gone, even though she was not wearing it at the time she was found. If the theory is true that Kathy managed to arrive home and took off her watch before she was killed, then it obviously would have been in Steve's best interest to get rid of it. If Steve killed Kathy in the heat of the moment and had to stage her accident scene relatively quickly, then her missing jewelry is probably one of those details he just didn't even think of at the time, because I'm sure there were a million things going through his mind. Now theoretically, if Kathy was killed by an outside party, you could push forward the theory that the perpetrator might have decided to steal her jewelry, but you can't really explain away Kathy's lack of makeup. Her boyfriend verified that Kathy was still wearing it when she left the hotel, and I doubt some killer is going to go to the trouble of wiping the makeup off her face. The other red flag is that there was evidence Kathy had been hit in the face, and she had a laceration on the back of her head, but blood was only found on her undergarments and the inside of her clothing, but not the outside. So does this suggest that she was not wearing this clothing at the time she was murdered, and the killer decided to redress her body after she was dead? If Kathy was unclothed when she was killed, then this opens up the disturbing possibility that she was raped by her own husband before she was strangled. It was bad luck for Steve that he had undergone a vasectomy months earlier, because otherwise, the investigators likely would have assumed that the semen found in her vagina was the result of consensual sex with her boyfriend. But since the other guy never had a vasectomy, Steve had to provide a story about him and Kathy having consensual sex with each other before she left on her date, though as far as I can tell, he did not share this until after the autopsy report revealed that there was no sperm in some of the semen. Obviously, it seems very unlikely that a woman who was reportedly on the verge of divorcing her husband would agree to have sex with him, but I will acknowledge that not every couple who is in a fractured relationship will handle things the same way, as some might continue to have sex with each other even if they are not getting along on a personal level. But in this particular case, Kathy had just asked Steve for a separation and asked him to move out of the house, and given that he had supposedly been sleeping on the couch, it sounds like they had not been intimate with each other in quite some time. And I seriously doubt that Kathy would agree to have sex with Steve right before she was planning to go meet another man for sex. In spite of the accusations that have been made about James Fulton by his granddaughter, James gave an interview during the Unsolved Mysteries episode where he presented a theory about Kathy's death, which I think is pretty plausible. Kathy's friend Charlotte corroborated that she received a phone call at around 2:30 a.m., which was an immediate hang-up, and she figured it was probably Steve. If Steve learned that Kathy had been lying about seeing Charlotte, and then called the phone number for the Best Western Hotel in Beaumont, he would have put two and two together and figured out Kathy was seeing another man. But it's possible that Steve had fallen asleep by the time Kathy first arrived home, which is why she had time to remove her makeup, jewelry, socks, and some of her clothing to get ready for bed. However, once Steve woke up, he likely confronted Kathy about where she had been, and this could have led to a heated confrontation in which he raped, beat, and strangled her to death. I'm not sure if Steve originally planned on killing Kathy that night, or if the whole thing was just a crime of passion, but he had to improvise quickly, which is why he cleaned and redressed Kathy's body and staged the fake car accident. It's interesting how Steve refused to turn the lights on when the police came to visit him at the house later that morning, which may have been because he did not yet have the opportunity to clean up all the incriminating evidence of foul play, such as blood on the carpet. Steve might have figured that he would have had a lot more time to cover his tracks, but the newspaper carrier discovered Kathy's body before daylight hit. It's interesting how Steve phoned Charlotte that morning and told her that Kathy had not arrived home yet, but kept changing his story about the exact time he phoned her, as he originally said the call took place between 5:30 and 6 a.m., and that the police showed up to inform him about what happened a short time later. However, Steve then started turning the clock back and claimed that the call took place at earlier times, such as 2:30, 3:30, and 4:30 a.m. It's possible that Steve intentionally staged the phone call to Charlotte in order to come across as the concerned husband who had no idea where his wife was, but if he made the call after the police already told him that Kathy was dead, that would be pretty damning. It's unclear if phone records were ever checked, but I'm guessing not, yet I get the feeling that Steve may have decided to change the time he made the call because he was paranoid about this discrepancy being uncovered. If you look at the timeline and all the known facts, it even discounts a lot of the details which are under dispute, such as Steve doing laundry and cleaning the carpet, the scenario presented by James Fulton makes complete sense. However, the big question is if there's enough evidence here to charge Steve with murder, bring him to trial, and convince a jury to find him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, unfortunately, the case has been hampered by a number of mistakes in the investigation, such as the Vidor Police Department taking pictures of the crime scene without any film in the camera. Needless to say, I'm not sure there have been many murder trials in which actual photos of the murder scene could not be admitted into evidence. It's pretty ridiculous that the Orange County District Attorney's Office would not grant the Vidor PD a search warrant for the Page resident until years after the crime took place, as you know they were never going to find anything after all that time. I know the Fulton family have accused the local authorities of orchestrating a cover-up for Steve, but even though the police undoubtedly made a number of mistakes, they have always maintained that their investigation was hampered by the District Attorney's Office. Indeed, whatever problems might have existed within the Vidor Police Department during the 1990s, it does seem like the current police chief, Rod Carroll, is enthusiastic about solving this case. The Orange County District Attorney is John Kimbrough, who took office 19 months after Kathy's death and is now serving his 7th term. After Kelly Siegler and her cold justice investigative team submitted their new case against Steve Page to Kimbrough a few years ago, he still felt the evidence was insufficient enough to charge him with murder. However, Siegler, who obviously has a lot of experience with this sort of thing, she said this might be the strongest case she's ever seen against a suspect which has never been brought to trial. So is Kimbrough intentionally stonewalling the investigation, or is he just very reluctant to prosecute a case that he's not entirely sure he can win at trial? It's hard to say, but it's worth reiterating that Steve Page has already lost a wrongful death lawsuit in civil court, and there's already a fairly strong case against him, so it makes you wonder what new evidence will be required to provide the final push to indict him. Regardless of whether Steve is innocent or guilty of this crime, what's not in dispute is that Kathy's death has caused a lot of pain and hurt for a lot of people, and I don't think anyone has suffered more than her daughter Erin, who has lost her mother, father, sister, and pretty much the entire side of her maternal family. I'm sure the release of 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri has been both a blessing and curse for Kathy's loved ones. Even though it helped generate a lot of new publicity for this case, it must feel like it's all for naught if it doesn't lead to a resolution and justice for Kathy. The way the investigation has been handled, you get the sense that it will take yet another person coming forward with key information before we finally see an arrest. Remember, just this past June, Crime Stoppers of Southeast Texas raised the reward to $50,000, so if you happen to know anything about the unsolved murder of Kathy Page, please contact their tip line at 409-833-TIPS. That's 409-833-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. I just released a bonus episode about a controversial unsolved mysteries case of a missing Marine named Kurt Borton, who was supposedly killed in action during the Vietnam War, but his family became convinced he survived and returned to the United States. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chili, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved 1971 disappearance of Lynn Schulze, whose case has been linked to recently convicted murderer Robert Durst. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon these past few weeks, and they are Sherry V, Alexis C, Amy and Jupiter, Brittany M, Heather A, Becky C, Tim, Angela F, Mary L, Camilla H, Emily Y, Claire Bearstare, Caitlin P, E M, and Laura D. Thank you all so much for your support. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.